Hey, what's going on, folks? This your boy New Jack coming at you live. And the NBA playoffs are finally here. And today, I'm going to give y'all my predictions of which teams are going to advance all the way to the second round, to the third round, all the way to the NBA championship game. Let's start with the Eastern Conference. You have number one seeded, the Atlanta Hawks, versus the number eight seeded Brooklyn Nets. I don't think this series is going to last long. I have the Atlanta Hawks winning this series in 5 games. So I have the Atlanta Hawks advancing to the second round. The number two seeded, the Cleveland Cavaliers, versus the number seventh seeded Boston Celtics. I don't think this series is going to last long. I have the Cleveland Cavaliers sweeping the Boston Celtics. I have the Cleveland Cavaliers winning this series in 4 games, sweeping the Boston Celtics. So I have the Cleveland Cavaliers advancing to the second round. The number three seeded, the Chicago Bulls, versus the number six seeded, the Milwaukee Bucks. Derrick Rose for the Chicago Bulls is back in the lineup. He's not 100%, but he's going to play. In this series, I have the Chicago Bulls defeating the Milwaukee Bucks in game 5. I would say this series will go to 5 games. So I have the Chicago Bulls advancing to the second round. The number fourth seeded, the Toronto Raptors, versus the number 5 seeded, the Washington Wizards. Now, this series is going to be very interesting. I believe this series will go to 7 games. In this series, I have the Washington Wizards defeating the Toronto Raptors in game 7. So I have the Washington Wizards advancing to the second round. So for my second round in the Eastern Conference, looks like this. I have the Atlanta Hawks going up against the Washington Wizards. And I have the Cleveland Cavaliers going up against the Chicago Bulls in the second round in the Eastern Conference. The second round in the Eastern Conference. Let's start with the first matchup. The Atlanta Hawks versus the Washington Wizards. This is going to be an interesting series. In this series, I have the Atlanta Hawks defeating the Washington Wizards in game 6. I believe this series will go to 6 games. So I have the Atlanta Hawks advancing to the Eastern Conference championship game. And for the second matchup, the Cleveland Cavaliers versus the Chicago Bulls. This is going to be an interesting matchup. LeBron James versus Derrick Rose. An interesting matchup. I believe this series will go to 7 games. Now, if Derrick Rose was 100%, I would pick the Chicago Bulls. But since Derrick Rose is not 100%, I'm going to have to go with the Cleveland Cavaliers. So I have the Cleveland Cavaliers defeating the Chicago Bulls in Game 7 to advance to the Eastern Conference Championship game. So for my Eastern Conference Finals game, looks like this. I have the Cleveland Cavaliers going up against the Atlanta Hawks. Two of the best teams out of the Eastern Conference squaring off. This is going to be a really good series. But toward the end, I have the Cavs defeating the Hawks in Game 6. I believe this series will go to 6 games. So I have the Cleveland Cavaliers defeating the Atlanta Hawks to advance to the NBA Finals. Now let's go over the Western Conference. Let's start with the first matchup. The number 1 seeded, the Golden State Warriors, going up against the number 8 seeded, the New Orleans Pelicans. I don't think this series is going to last long. I have the Warriors defeating the Pelicans in Game 5. So I have the Golden State Warriors advancing to the second round. The number 2 seeded, the Houston Rockets, going up against the number 7 seeded, the Dallas Mavericks. Now this is going to be a really good series. I have this series going to 7 games. In this series, I have the Houston Rockets defeating the Dallas Mavericks in Game 7. So I have the Houston Rockets advancing to the second round. The number 3 seeded, the LA Clippers, going up against the number 6 seeded, the 5-time NBA champions, the San Antonio Spurs. Now this is going to be a really good, interesting series. In this series, I have the San Antonio Spurs defeating the LA Clippers in Game 6. I have this series going into 6 games. So I have the San Antonio Spurs advancing to the second round. The number 4 seeded, the Portland Trailblazers, going up against the number 5 seeded, the Memphis Grizzlies. Now this is going to be a really good series, I believe. But toward the end, I have the Memphis Grizzlies winning this series in Game 6. I have this series going into 6 games. And I have the Memphis Grizzlies defeating the Portland Trailblazers. So I have the Memphis Grizzlies advancing to the second round. So for my second round in the Western Conference, looks like this. The Golden State Warriors going up against the Memphis Grizzlies. And the Houston Rockets going up against my San Antonio Spurs. The first matchup in the Western Conference, you have the Golden State Warriors going up against the Memphis Grizzlies. This is going to be a really good series. I have this series going into 7 games. In this series, I have the Golden State Warriors defeating the Memphis Grizzlies in Game 7. I believe this series will go to 7 games. And I have the Golden State Warriors defeating the Grizzlies in Game 7. So I have the Golden State Warriors advancing to the Western Conference Championship game. And the next matchup, you have the Houston Rockets going up against my San Antonio Spurs. Now this is going to be a really good series. I have this series going into 6 games. And of course, I have my San Antonio Spurs defeating the Houston Rockets in Game 6. So I have my San Antonio Spurs advancing to the Western Conference Championship game. So for my Western Conference Finals game, looks like this. I have my San Antonio Spurs going up against the Golden State Warriors. Now this is going to be a really good series. This series can go to either Game 6 or Game 7. It can go either way. But in order for the Spurs to defeat the mighty Golden State Warriors, they're going to have to win Game 6. Because if this series goes into Game 7, the San Antonio Spurs are not going to defeat Golden State in Game 7 at their home court. It's not going to happen. So what I believe what's going to happen, I believe that my San Antonio Spurs will win this series in Game 6. They're going to have to. It has to end in Game 6. Because if this series goes into Game 7, it's a wrap for the San Antonio Spurs. But I believe, so I have my San Antonio Spurs defeating the Golden State Warriors in Game 6 to advance to the NBA Finals to play the Cleveland Cavaliers. So for my NBA Finals game, looks like this. The San Antonio Spurs going up against the Cleveland Cavaliers. LeBron gets to play the San Antonio Spurs again for the 3rd year in a row. He is 1 out of 2 against my San Antonio Spurs. Will he win? Will he get his revenge? I would have to say no. It's not going to happen, LeBron. I'm sorry. The Spurs will defeat the Cavs in Game 6. I believe this series will go to 6 games. And I believe that the Spurs will defeat the Cavs in Game 6. So I have my San Antonio Spurs defeating the Cleveland Cavaliers to win the NBA championship for the second time in a row. And this will be our 6th NBA title. I hope y'all enjoyed this. There's more videos coming at y'all sometime this week or next week. So y'all stay tuned. I can lead you to the water, but I can't help you drink it. Y'all gonna look at this video as y'all doing right now. And when all this is said and done, after the NBA finals are over, and when the Spurs captures their 6th title, y'all gonna come back on this video and below my comment section and put down New Jack. Once again, brother, you right again.